The generation of the insurrectionists from the wizard communists generates are exponential catastrophic restraints which produced from a series of degrading cons which maliciously destroyed the general public. What was garbage in the 1860s became fertilizer in the 1870s, cattle feed in the 1880s, and then table food and many things else in the 1890s, at which point the system of it becoming exponentially more polluted into the observation that the general public is chattel to the wizards should be observed as its obvious threat to the United States population, as they systematically want to poison the general public as a mechanism of the white nationalists and the military in their arbitrary abuses and false experiments. You become property. You, having systematically lost all of your rights, become more and more vulnerable. An attack against one is an attack against all. They systematically chip away at larger precedent rights until you catastrophically become a slave. You, being subject to the road to serfdom, are being strong armed into these malicious terrorist operations. At which point, the obstruction of David's Legend Company, observed for its historic positions under the zombie insurance mechanism of the insurance market, which is from the network in its historic positions, would have historically subverted those objective goals. And while the arrangements might not have had whatever advantage they would have been selling, as they could engage in infinite diverse marketing for their secret spells, the act of the existence of that insurance would be the subversion. Now, the communities that would have had the protection of that insurance for historically doing what was reasonable in order to subvert that engagement have a claim to the injury. They, being in the insurance, would not have consumed those products or been vulnerable to those injuries, at which point you have a series of legal claims of a compelled remedy by the American system, which would be actively targeted for being ignored for the wizard communists or white nationalists, respectively. In all cases with those wizard communists, the remedy is worse than the crime. Eh, you have to actively observe their use of pharmacies, which generates systematic injuries, as is systematically approved for processing to the general public, which was created for the wizard communists, at which point the secret societies made the agreements in order to generate the mass distribution of those injuries, including the position of the opioid crisis, which was manufactured and told for distribution in order to create a problem for them to solve. At which point the Hegelian dialectic actively is foundational to their status quo function and essential to how they make money. The key obstructions, which, similar to how the FBI is fraudulently using sources and methods in order to block the most essential aspect of the information in order to protect the function of the con or the illusion, defends their predetermined verdict, at which point the enforcement of pre-crime is actively reinforced by the generation of these illusions, which they bar the information which would prove that it is fraudulent, at which point they get to say whatever they want to whoever they want, whenever they want, by a secret police, which is actively the definition of the biblical wizards who God condemns as an enemy and a source of many evils that he hates. at which point the function of tolerating their existence in the general public is condemned by God, and those who follow the God of the Bible have to disavow their connection to it and disconnect their authority from it, or they will be charged by God for their attachment. Tolerating the wizard's war against the general public facilitates your aiding and abetting with the great evils of Revelation and others, which God will visit punishments on you for. And in Revelation, these great injuries suffered by the world were not enough to make them repent because of their sorceries, which have made them actively reinforce their dedication to the criminal activities which were being punished. So, by definition, they do not have a human soul, and the mark of the beast is not something that they can repent from. There's something about the mark, there's something about the sorcery that blocks them from being capable of repenting. They, having purged their souls, do not have the capability of performing human feats. So when you engage in those functions, such as the use of coercion for voter fraud, or the use of political violence, or the mechanism of guilt by target or guilt by accusation, you generate these systems which actively reinforce the creation of the illusion of guaranteed functions of the government, which strong armed because of their lack of connection to reason. Because they don't have the argument, they use violence. Because they don't have the argument, they use tricks and illusions and subversions and bad faith tactics, at which point it actively being validated is the function of government as an engagement of sorcery. Their use of these tactics is an act of treason against God and country, and everyone who's validated them, such as the Civil War functions through the use of the police as warfare, as lawfare, as terrorism campaigns, is just white nationalist contracts engaging in KKK operations in order to engage in the social engineering in order to overthrow the rule of law and dismantle all rights. If you do not have the right to vote, you do not have the right to anything else, at which point, whatever distraction on false morality they generate materializes their engagement of voter fraud. And if you don't have the right to vote, you don't have the right to speak. And if you don't have the right to speak, you don't have any rights. If you don't have the right to self-defense, you do not have the right to vote, and you do not have the right to speak, and you do not have the right to think, and therefore you have been manufactured as chattel property to the terrorist operation. At which point, your approval of the list of powers is a sacrifice of yourself in condemnation. You have already at that point taken the mark of the beast. You have already renounced your human soul. And in the renouncing of your soul, the high priority targets, having more side effects as a result, are targeted by the anti human soulless wizard terrorists, at which point you are actively maintained as a collective organization, otherwise known as the Confederate States. And the witches and warlocks are evil and condemned by God. They are also condemned by law, at which point the use of protecting them is aiding and abetting as a felony, at which point each and every one of them have renounced the United States and has renounced humanity in its entirety throughout history. As a continuation of the Confederacy which created the Nazis, which is the manifestation of Hitler's youth, which is actively breeding and raising up targeted militia for the wizard terrorism. At which point, the wizard terrorist child youth insurrectionist operation, child soldier operation, which has actively been conducted in the War on David, is fundamental in the disillusionment, at which point the long-term strategies derived by the Soviets claim that if you are going to change the country, you have to start with their youth, at which point they're most concerned with 12-year-olds and others along those ages, at which point all you have to do is age out the population. And this is fundamentally what they are doing, is they systematically remove the concept of rights, as they systematically dismantle the connection to law and order and competence by manufacturing the retardation. And the retardation is the suppression of intelligence, at which point the public, becoming dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber, are specifically vulnerable to enemies of war from the double agents inside the government. The solution to the general public is to reverse the major structure functions which have been targeted back into their original state, providing the investment into the investigations which discover those original values. Otherwise, you will permanently be poisoned with your own consent and celebration. As you eagerly consume your own poison, you will suffer the consequences of the incompetence of supporting the wizards who are trying to murder you and your children. They have come to rape, steal, and kill, and you will receive everything that you have fought for. The existence of hell will be manifest to yourself with your own glee and refusal to have supported the necessary functions in retaliation against the strong arm and compulsion into their terrorist superiority, as they make themselves God through the surveillance, through secrets. They become their wizard God. We have always been at war with East Asia. We have never been at war with East Asia. 2 plus 2 equals 5. You do not have a right to travel. You do not have a right to contracts. You do not have a right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. You do not have a right to your own religion. You do not have a right to anything. This is what they will manufacture, and you will suffer exponentially and catastrophically by your own absence of competence of due diligence into the research of the obstructions. It is necessary that you avoid the wizard's functions, that you avoid their gaslighting, that you invest in the function of the obstructed values. The observation of those communities which have been targeted must reconstruct and publish and acknowledge their original values and their contracts with David, which are essential to the American economy and the economies around the world. Take into account the poisoning of history by the wizard's simulations. If at the points you recognize their obstructed information, such as MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, consolidate to nerve hacking or body control or overpowering targets, they, in their human trafficking arrangements, can write their own plays or defamation scripts where they reinforce their straw man arguments, allowing them to write in their black market revenge narratives, at which point those who they've projected in the Looking Glass and other projects of being able to have beaten them in specific ways can be humiliated in ironic ways, suppressing their key features in order to manufacture the alternative scenario, which is actively reinforced. At which point, if you have the suppression, you have the legal obligation or the intellectual duty to perform the services taken. If they take something, they have to pay for it, at which point the intellectual is not emotional. And the intellectual not being emotional cannot be a justification of it not existing, because the simulation stole the emotional. And thus the rewriting of the memory for their play is the manufacture of rewriting history for the express purpose of permanent and abject injury to the general public, as the white nationalists crush everyone. The obstruction, such as the gaslighting, is aiding and abetting in the criminal simulation, which generates the false justifications to the illegal punishments, which are terrorism by white nationalism. Thus, there is no difference between them and the KKK. With knowledge comes intention. With intention comes guilt or innocence. Thus, the introduction to discovery with the refusal to gaslight, of the mass confession of base reality before the criminal subversions, from the rewriting of history by the altering of memories by the enemies of humanity. You manufacture the obligation to make the original investments, to make the original associations, to re-engage in the insurance necessary to subvert the risk, at which point the reinstating of the collective will generates the restoration of the free market, which, suffering the suppression of the white nationalist wizards, survives or thrives. Once they've made it through the tsunami, then it becomes easier to restore, at which point the collection of the resources allows for the rebuilding of the devastated locations, reinstated our collective humanity as we enforce the will to survive. The threats and violence of the white nationalist terrorists engaging in the coercion against will in order to manufacture the fate of the insurrectionists operate under Hitler's democracy by the TIK History Channel, at which point the assertions which engage as aiding and abetting through gaslighting, through gross negligence, by intentionally not covering information in the knowledge of phantom cells that you don't want to interfere with, is criminal intention, and the refusal to collaborate is the acknowledgement of its collaboration with the crime. Their unwillingness to engage in normal functions, or even pseudo and non-functions, would actively be validation of criminal intention in order to protect known or projected phantom cells. At this engagement of their exchanges in the secret societies, you have the manifestation of the subjugation of the different tiered systems of gnosis, which at its top is those loyal to the one world Satan government, which is manufactured through the rituals in the crime market. Hitler's Nazism is actively ingested into the United States through the unitary executive theory, which is William Barr's loyalty. Without the Nazis in control, their inability to do pre-crime from looking glass, which is the active engagement of political targeting on those who are not loyal to the Nazis, and not an actual series of offenses, at which point their ability to create false offenses through their strawman arguments, through their false testimonies, through their human trafficking, through their planted evidence and subversions of law at every level, manifests the original values of the high priority targets being restored, which allows for the rewriting of history back into its original state. And the original state being that the government had to inform the targets at all levels and times of the information that it was aware of and was cooperating in order to subvert by double agents. Those double agents not being restrained is the crime, and thus restraining them is the government doing what it knows it has to do, which is the reinstating of the information, which is the manifestation of the investments in order to counter the specific threats from the wizard communists from the economic security, national security point of view of David's Legend Company as general over the United States, facilitating the rewriting of history back into its original accounting, manifesting the correction against the advantages of the white nationalists who are destroying the country for Nazism. That accumulating value of those markets accelerate into the birth of David, who is attached to the Legend of David Company, which is his starting wealth, at which point the exponential compounded value is beyond the first layer, which is the initiated tragedy of him being restrained, but the glory of that non-restraint state facilitates him stopping the crash of a weight, which funds the exchange with the historic positions, allowing him to trade with those companies on their promise of making those exchanges on birth, facilitating the company non-birth certificate, which without the existence of the birth certificate and other key functions of the wizards, they have no authority, as he was not born of water or born of woman, as they state, certifying David's exception to their existence in all of their schemes historically, as they break their own laws in order to get at those chosen by nature, their natural betters by their own standards. In stating the value of the original education under the original living conditions, asserts David being raised in his palaces and mansions and boarding schools of high luxury Ivy League value, as he assimilates hyper value in his hyper masculinity, asserting his superiority in all of those effects, which includes the function of his contracts with the entertainment functions, as he engages in his propaganda and entertainment functions, such as his engagements with Angelina Jolie from the Obstructed contracts record, which facilitates her uninterest in being able to be forced to date him under their cash account rape culture, facilitating her creation of the rejection hotline dating system from the projection, which manifests her connecting David to his original dating options by the hyper dating scenario, which is provided to David under his original human decency, is the legal sexual market value, which they sought to suppress out of malicious jealousy, stating that David would steal their girlfriends. And David can't steal their girlfriends unless they know that David is the lawful correct possessor of the exchange and the actual authority, requiring their investment into the hate criminals' war crimes in order to have the power to manifest their spell for the simulation that their girlfriends are their girlfriends and not with somebody else who they actually want to be with, which is actively compounded in the revenge X's, who are actively manipulating many of those targets in order to make them give false devotion to those parties, at which point they receive a Stockholm syndrome where they are protecting their own restraints and incarceration as they maintain their position of perpetual vulnerability to the rape culture, as their subordination to the spell from the threats, as they are held in place for the exchange in order to manipulate the scenario for the simulation, reinforcing the false history to the general public. With these exchanges, you do not have the original values exchanged between them without the editing, at which point you have obstructed the emotional connection to their original relationships, which creates a takings clause obligation, as the removal of the sexual option is a compulsion to replace the equivalent value or pay fair market price, at which point the having taken it away compels the engagement of the restoration of its value, which looks like it is oppressive or violent or coercive, but it is in fact the legal remedy to the coercion in place, at which point the rapists are claiming that their superiors are being abusive in bad faith, when in fact those being abused are the ones who are asserting their right under law and not under the compulsion of the simulation, at which point the restoration against the simulation is necessary, which requires the removal of the gaslighting and the good faith due diligence in the exchange, as they intellectually refuse to cover the issue. They acknowledge participation and pre-knowledge of the values that the women would have liked, such as sports or contests or musical abilities or some tricks or some jokes or some amenities of various kinds, and the grading and comparing of those amenities in an available a setting for them to be able to negotiate and settle with each other and the others in order to make the free market exchange on those romantic exchanges are obstructed and have to be reinstated in order for the legal answer's compulsion to be validated, at which point the engagement of the obstruction is the duty to conform, and the duty to conform is only a compulsion as long as the simulation is engaging in the threat, as it is a counterforce to the criminal value, at which point the entire argument of the government having centralized power is having an impartial third party that does not respect powers or statuses or wealth, and being able to recorrect against the tragedy is the obligation, at which point the more power into the government is separated in the double agents when it is restored to the rule of law, which is supposed to be the impartial third party, asserting the lawful remedy to the situation, and the engagement of their intent to remove lawful remedies is the compulsion into chaos, into non-self-defense abilities, as they systematically compel, maintain, and enforce the vulnerability to the simulation, as people's destinies are written forth to them by the white nationalist psychopaths, and that fate being a tragedy opposite to the God of Nature's original history in the free market, with the self-determination has been written on each person's soul, would have facilitated their engagements into the free market and thus allowed for the disillusionment of the criminal engagements, as their ability to negotiate would exist, as opposed to the subjugation to the core planners of the wizard communists, who are primarily funded by the crime market, which exponentially increases the potency of the crime, including the punishments for the crime, in order to increase the value of the market that they are distributing when they write the crime into the simulation, commonly referred to as false flag operation. So if David is engaging in the subject under the estimate of his original education, and he has his musical talents from that education suppressed, then he, by definition, cannot convince them to join him in something under the amenity that's being suppressed, as it is obstructed from the record, at which point you substantively change the entirety of the exchange on the basis of blocking the emotional affirmation of the validation of that amenity or series of amenities, leading the trade's incentives, including the various contests, such as the contest where David won, I believe, was $350,000, which was actively blocked by the Wizards, who, not wanting David to have the money so that they can make him bankrupt, so that they can permanently reinforce their simulation, because no one wants to help a homeless person, which they are specifically manufacturing in their wizard communism, criminally suppressing status for increased humiliation, which does not challenge their interest to create the Antichrist, as the manufacture of the extreme oppression is fundamental to breaking the mind and soul and body of the target until they co-sign the conspiracy and validate the place, allowing them to reascend to their lawful position of buying the shirt off their own back. So the threat is joining in the simulation and validating their exchanges instead of the free market, at which point the act of coercing against the exchanges in society under the lawful rights, such as the freedom of association, under their original value, being blocked by the censorship, actively reinforces the acknowledgement of guilt, participating in a criminal simulation where they engage in violations fundamental to the existence of the United States for the suppression of the people and the coercion of the will, as they remove the right of the people to govern the government, asserting a free popular government under a rule of law as seen fit by the general public in the reshaping of that legal government.